Hello, let's now take a look at chapter 23, where we're going to look at the continent of Africa. Starting with section 1, we're going to be looking at some of the independence movements that occurred after World War II and how many of the African countries today uh, are still affected by that period of colonialism. There is some debate today on what impact colonialism had on Africa, whether it was good, overall good, or more bad, and that's some of the stuff that we'll be debating in class as well, and how different African countries have developed or not developed based on the length of colonization, and see if we can determine what impact long term that has had. So those are some of the things we're going to be looking at today and throughout the week. Like I said, the colonial legacy, Western imperialism, which I'm sure you've studied in the past, brought about the colonization of almost all of Africa with very few exceptions. And after World War I and II, particularly, many of the African countries got their freedoms in the 1950s and 60s. And then these countries followed a route oftentimes of the group that led independence, then took over, and oftentimes began a history of corruption and abuses, and oftentimes led the new country into the ways of um, harsh dictatorial rule, as we will see. The Europeans, of course, did bring a lot of good things that we'll be discussing, but also undermined several things that we as Christians would consider good, like the family structure that was evident in Africa prior to colonization, but also got rid of things that we as Christians would be against, like pagan rituals, voodoo, different non-Christian cultural habits that the largely Christian missionaries and colonizing countries push for change. Also, bringing in medicine, infrastructure, industrial machinery, and modern transportation into Africa. So the European doctors came with new ways to treat long-time illnesses in Africa, and these then oftentimes helped cure some of those diseases. Now, of course, today we see Africa again struggling with the Ebola virus, so that's something we want to keep our eye on in the news, on how Africa today is dealing with that new outbreak of Ebola and the devastating consequences that it has. And we see too that these outbreaks of disease are part of God's judgment on sin for the world, and once man fell into sin, corruption and disease and famine came with that curse of sin. The other thing was the borders. As you recall, Africa was divided up by the colonial powers, not regarding the different African tribal lines. So that continues to cause problems today between different tribals, rivalries, as well as religious affiliations. So there has been a rising tide of nationalism ever since World War II, where most of the countries now are free. In fact, all the African countries are. And they are also trying to promote more pride in their own African cultures and their ability to make it on their own without the American or European countries guiding them. Different routes in Ghana. As you know, Kwame Nkrumah won independence there and then became the president for many years. Same in Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta also displaced the white settlers, oftentimes radical political movements entailed after the freedom from the colonial powers, like in South Africa and other countries, in Kenya. Once the black Africans retained control of their own country, there was oftentimes brutal reprisals against the white settlers who had taken over, and a lot of times their land was forcibly taken from them. Particularly nowadays in South Africa, this is an ongoing problem where many of the white settlers fear for their lives. And also in some of the more Muslim African countries, Christians fear for their lives as well when these changes took place, like in Algeria. So after the fighting with the French there, the Algerians have won their independence, but there continues to be ongoing challenges in all three of these countries. The Cold War was also affected, just like all parts of the world, where the Soviets would try to prop up different blocks of African countries to support their causes, and America would do would try to do the same with countries that they found support for, and would boost the military and try to help them economically. So those weapons and guerrillas and rival clans were supported based on their political affiliation. There has been attempts at African regionalism, or Pan-Africanism it's called, where they gather to try to pledge strength together as Africa. We mentioned earlier that Muammar Gaddafi was one who tried to lead a Pan-African movement. It has not gotten off the ground much since the upheaval in Libya, where Gaddafi was ousted and killed. Also the upheaval in Egypt, and in South Africa, the unrest between black and white violence. So these are the main economic powers of Africa, and since those are still in turmoil, it's been very difficult to get African cooperation on a more regional or wide continental basis. There has been many different examples of disasters. The biggest one recently is in Somalia, but also in Sudan, where there's tribal rivalries, there's killing off of different races and different, particularly Christians. There's a big question on how much good aid is doing. Financial aid doesn't seem to help Africa at all, and private organizations have had better success with reaching into Africa to relieve some of these problems. Somalia was and still is one of the biggest problems that hasn't had a government for almost 20 years. It's governed by various warlords. We did, as Americans, intervene in Somalia in the 1990s until several of our servicemen were killed and President Bill Clinton ordered withdrawal, and since then Somalia has kind of been on its own. So these are some examples. Also, of course, in Liberia and in the Congo are other examples that we'll be looking at throughout this lesson.